Our first speaker today is Betsy Rosasco. She is an alumna of Smith College and the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, and she's currently the research curator of European painting and sculpture at the Princeton University Art Museum. In 1981, Betsy joined the staff of the Princeton University Art Museum, whose collection of European painting and sculpture comprises art from the later Middle Ages to the modern period. Her museum publications are therefore exceptionally broad-ranging, including essays on Wilhelm Leimbruck, Modigliani, Kokoschka in the catalog Cézanne and the Modern, masterpieces of European art from the Perelman collection, and an article on François Boucher's Aaron and the Dolphin, published in the record of the Princeton University Art Museum. Betsy wrote her doctoral thesis on the sculptures of the Chateau of Marly during the reign of Louis XIV, and she has continued to work on French royal garden sculpture throughout her career. Her recent publications are Les sculptures de Marly de Louis XIV, influence vénitienne et destinée sous Louis XV, in the online bulletin of the Research Center of the Chateau de Versailles. And Hermes of Versailles in the 1680s was published in the Princeton University Library Chronicle in 2014. This morning, Betsy will take us outdoors with her paper on Versailles, Marly, and Dresden, Magnificence and Its Limits. Please welcome Betsy Rosasco.
Thank you. The concept of magnificence was rooted in the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle and emphasized for Christian worship by St. Thomas Aquinas. Can you all hear me? The humanist Leon Battista Alberti promoted it in sacred and secular architecture, and it came to be regarded as a princely attribute and virtue. At the court of Ferrara in 1516, Ludovico Ariosto first published Orlando Furioso, an epic with descriptions of magnificent palaces and tournaments. His text was admired for abundance and variety. The outdoor fête at Versailles, Les Plaisirs de l'Île Enchantée, which you see here on the screen, of 1664, is based on this model. Yes. Louis XIV was Roger, held captive with other knights by the sorceress in a palace that exploded in fireworks, a magnificent spectacle. And this widely read epic continued to have currency at the court. For example, in a bronze of Roger and Angelica given to Louis XIV by André Le Notre in 1693. Yet the picture of unbridled spending on magnificence in European courts was complicated by other values. One of the issues driving the Protestant Reformation, started by Martin Luther, was a critique of wasteful ostentation on the part of the church, and it extended to the extravagance of the ruling elite. The Protestant elite classes were thus torn between two ideals, the proper expression of rank and the sobriety and restraint of religious culture. The garden sculptures of Versailles, Marly, and Dresden show signs of these doctrinal differences in the way magnificence was regarded and deployed. In 1683, Louis XIV secretly married Madame de Maintenon, who was born a Huguenot. Although she became a Catholic early on, some Calvinist habits of mind persisted. I think her interest in pedagogy was expressed in some garden sculptures. In Dresden, Augustus the Strong became Elector of Saxony after his brother died unexpectedly in 1694. A Lutheran in the cradle of the Reformation, he converted in 1697 to secure the throne of Poland, where Catholicism was mandatory for the king. With new opportunities for his dynasty, he sought to express his regal and Catholic status, but remained mindful of Protestant tradition too. We see Magnificence here at Versailles in the Salon of Abundance. She carries a pyramid, palm, and building plan, symbolizing works by means of which the greatest princes transmit to posterity their name or celebrated memory. Transformed from country chateau to palace beginning in the 1660s, Versailles became the seat of the court in 1682. It had the richest outdoor sculpture garden in Europe. On the north of short axis, fountains in lead and bronze create anti-natural effects with jets rising high at the Dragon Fountain and water descending steps at the Pyramid, as well as a Diana fountain with a veil of water and gurgles in the basins of the Allée of Children. On the south arm, the Orangerie included a garden with French and Italian sculptures from the royal collection. These ornaments elicited praise from the early visitors as signs of royal power. The east-west axis shows the life of Apollo. At the west, the sun god rises in his chariot, and on the east was the marble Apollo tended by Thetis and the nymphs in the Grotto of Apollo by Girardon. These marble sculptures were moved into the garden very soon when the grotto was demolished. In 1674, Charles Lebrun designed marble sculptures for a water parterre at the crossing, the four elements, the four seasons, the four temperaments, based on Aristotle's natural philosophy, plus four types of poems, four times of day, and four parts of the world identified by the attributes that Ripa specifies. You see some of his drawings here, the elements and the parts of the world. Along with the groups of elements, they were intended to surround Parnassus with Apollo, Muses, and Pegasus, but the plan was discarded very early. Instead, Jules Ardouin Mansart designed the present basins in the 1680s. The bronze figures of French rivers and children are more appropriate near the Hall of Mirrors above. The marble sculptures that were left over were aligned along hedges with copies of ancient works from Roman collections in random order or according to formal affinities. Fragmentary remains of the macrocosm of Lebrun, they remind us of the scientific revolution that rendered Aristotle's worldview obsolete. Yet Aristotle's method of teaching philosophy, talking while walking, I think may have played a role in the lower Versailles gardens. Here I mean the wide allée that goes toward the Apollo fountain. And what you're seeing in the foreground is the fountain of Latona, which had started out with figures on the level of the water and in the 1680s was raised on this large marble pedestal by Mansart. I think Madame de Maintenon influenced the moralizing sculptures leading to the Apollo basin. They could have been intended as teaching aids for Abbé Fenelon, the preceptor of the king's grandson, the Duke of Burgundy. At the entrance of the allée were groups by Pierre Puget. Milo of Crotona was set in place in 1683. An ancient athlete, he came up on a tree partly split by woodmen and tried to complete the work, but the trunk snapped shut on him and he became prey for carnivorous beasts. In 1685, Perseus freeing Andromeda was set across from it. Chained to a rock to appease a sea monster, the princess was rescued by Perseus. Both Perseus and Milo appear in emblem books. Perseus as an exemplar of virtu in the sense of military valor, and Milo as a fallen hero brought low by hubris. Early visitors to Versailles write that everything was related to the king, and this likely held true in the 1680s. Perseus could easily allude to Louis XIV, but why was the cautionary tale of Milo included, since according to royal propaganda, the king could do no wrong? The warning must have been directed to his successors, I think. The allée would be a mirror of princes, based on a genre known in antiquity and popular with humanists. It would be not only for the Duke of Burgundy, but for all future French kings. Facing each other are fidelity and what the French edition of Ripa called fourberie, deceitfulness or guile, holding a mask. Ariosto warned that jealousy made real friendships rare at court, and this pairing seems to illustrate his warning. Those figures are followed by vases, copies of ancient sculptures, and 4 figures from myth, history, and literature. Dido, who tried to thwart Aeneas's mission to found Rome, Cyparissus, who became a cypress tree while mourning the stag he accidentally killed, Achilles, disguised as a girl to avoid going to war, and faithful Artemisia, of whom I don't have a slide, but she's drinking the wine mixed with her husband's ashes. We remember Ariosto's description of his patron's humanist education, reading classical texts that give examples of what to do and not to do. And these that I'm showing you here is a good example of what not to do. We also remember the lead figures of animals from Aesop's fables in the labyrinth of Versailles that were once used for the education of the Duke's father. At the other end of the alley are groups nearly the size of the Farnese bull. If the first Puget groups remind you of the Laocoon, these are of a large size and have these large settings. They were put in place in 1705 and designed by Girardin in the 1680s. Aristeas and Proteus, that you see here, is from Virgil's Georgics. And it shows the beekeeper Aristeas beneath the ocean, binding the shepherd of the sea. And you note the baby seals, who are his flock. The reason for this was because he wanted to find out the secret of how bind him to keep him from changing shapes and force him to reveal the secret why Aristeas' bees had died. Across from it, Ino and Melicertes shows a moment in Ovid's Metamorphoses after Ino and her husband have been driven insane, and her husband has slain their eldest son. She flees with the second son toward a cliff where they will throw themselves into the ocean. They will be transformed by the gods, or some say Bacchus, into the maritime deities Leucotheus and Palemon, gods seen in sculptures in a nearby grove. The guidebooks explain the stories, and scholars note that Aristeas was Apollo's son. But why the stories are paired and their deeper meaning are not addressed. There may be several answers. Aristeas and Ino are paired in Orlando Furioso as denizens of the deep underwater realm. Proteus issued from his grotto, and Ino fled with her son when Roger slew the orc and saved Angelica. Although this episode was not part of the Versailles Fête of 1664, older courtiers and the king himself would remember that he had played Roger in the opening entry, as well as the jousting game of Bog, which was a game of catching a golden ring on a lance in which the king excelled. But what about these deeper meanings? According to Virgil, Apollo's oracle told Aristeas to pin down Proteus to find out this secret. This may have been an allusion, I think, to the secrets of the Book of Nature, the Christian concept that God can be understood through the study of his creation in its myriad forms. The natural world was studied by the French Royal Academy of Sciences, founded in 1666 and brought more closely under royal protection in 1699. Aristeas and Proteus could therefore enjoin a future king to encourage scientific discoveries that, in practical terms, improve human life, and in religious terms, better our understanding of God's creation. As for Ino and Melicerte, this story resonates with another myth of an unhappy mother and child in the garden. This is the fountain of Latona, which I showed a minute ago. imploring the protection of Jupiter. Her cause is vindicated when the peasants who denied her clean water to drink are changed to frogs as punishment. Ino and Latona share in common the jealousy of Juno, who vindictively pursued Latona and her children fathered by Jupiter, and drove Ino and her husband mad in revenge for their protection of Jupiter's son by Semele, Bacchus. The emotion of jealousy is a key concept in the celebration of Louis XIV. Here, Domenico Guidi's fame of Louis XIV, carved in Rome, which reached France and was displayed at Versailles in the 1680s, shows the figure of fame writing the deeds of Louis XIV with a personification of jealousy seen on the left under the figure who gnaws her own heart, while a snake chews at her entrails. Both Latona and Ino exhibit piety and faith, ultimately triumphing over the jealousy of Juno. I am among the scholars who believe Latona celebrates Louis XIV's mother, Anne of Austria, who saved the monarchy from civil unrest during her regency. Other scholars think such allusions would have been inappropriate and really unthinkable at Versailles, especially in such a prominent location. And I could cite just recently Gérard Sabatier's book about Versailles sculpture, and also Tom Hedin's article online about the North Axis. But how do we explain the prominent base added to the Latona fountain in the 1680s, except as a gesture of filial piety? I think devotion to his mother was one of the king's character traits, and his piety was a legacy of Anne of Austria. Thus, I would propose that Aristeas and Proteus and Ino and Melicertes pair understanding through the book of nature and science and piety, the key lessons for future kings. Marly was Louis XIV's retreat for short stays with his family and friends. Begun in 1679, it was finished around the time the king married Madame de Maintenon, and had relaxed etiquette that I think must have been designed so that the disparity in their ranks would be less noticeable. This is the interior. The gardens behind the royal pavilion and the 12 small pavilions, which you see down there near the bottom, the 6 on the left side, were sumptuously decorated with sculpture. They contained groves that were arranged like pearls on a string. The Versailles gardens included some ancient sculptures, but Marly used principally ancient works in the first iteration. When Mansart became the superintendent of royal buildings in 1699, commissions were given for modern marble sculpture for the main axis, which you see with the water basins. Large figures were to be seen from afar. This is the Louvre Cour Marly, with Fame and Mercury up on the balcony, and below the Seine and Marne. These figures were integral to Mansart's waterfalls and basins, with their subjects based on geography. The Seine and Marne, seen here, and Neptune and Amphitrite, which were on the great water cascade, the river or rivière. And for the lower water basins, the Seine and Marne and the Loire and Loire on large plinths grouped, and water nymphs. The two figures of fame signified complementary types of the king's fame in war and in peace, as responses to Guidi's group. The concept of a marble figure about to take flight challenges rationality and belongs to a magic realm, whereas the Guidi is completely heavy and earthbound. Although it's much pierced, clearly Quasvok was trying to prove that he could do better by piercing the marble much more audaciously. And also in the Guidi group, the king is competing with and surpassing the heroes of antiquity, who are seen on medallions on the ground that contrast with the large medallion of Louis XIV. So Caesar, Alexander the Great, Scipio Africanus, and Trajan have all been completely cast in the shade by Louis XIV. Antoine Quasvok's Fame and Mercury, of which you see Fame here, show that Louis XIV is beyond compare. His groups recall Ariosto's allusion to Pegasus rising up among the stars as a constellation, or his Roger riding the flying hippogriff, a combination horse and griffin. And this illusion that I'm making makes the idea of a Pegasus carrying a rider seem less strange, although there was a little problem with what to do with Fame's wings, and they seem to have been suppressed in order not to have a double pair of wings here. And here is Mercury, who is the peaceful Fame, and not only carrying his caduceus, which symbolizes peace, but also the shield with the relief of the king's grandson being offered the throne of Spain, an entirely peaceful transaction. At Marly, the king indulged his love of gardening with ever-changing arrangements, and I'm showing you here the ocean goddess Amphitrite, who was seen in a fish basin in 1709 as a pendant to a river goddess Arethusa in the opposite river basin, fish basin. Continuing in bilateral symmetry, they were moved to new settings in 1711, and then again in 1713. These are images from watercolors commissioned in 1714 and intended to make a record of these varying states. And here is a small cascade that was existed only 6 years and then was altered to include expensive marble sculptures, as seen here. The only section that suggests serious purpose is the upper area on the hills beside the Riviera, as you see extending behind the chateau and away from the lower basins. There, bronze casts of antiquities took their place under the trees, the Laocoon, the dying Gaul, very serious subjects, in a somber, thought-provoking display, and I think they were intended for a philosophical garden for solitary meditation. It was laid out in 1700 during the absence of the Duke of Burgundy, perhaps as a surprise, and it seems to have been private because it's not recorded among the watercolors. The dichotomy between rich lower garden and spare contemplative upper garden may have been due to the different functions of gardens as seen by Louis XIV, who wanted magnificence in all things, and Madame de Maintenon, who wanted to form a philosopher king. In Dresden, even before Augustus the Strong became Elector of Saxony, the grosser garden of the electoral country palace had sculptures by Balthasar Permoser, who had been in the service of the Grand Duke of Florence until 1690, when he arrived in Dresden to work on both ivory sculpture for the Kunstkammer and garden sculptures. Most of the latter are lost, but 2 Hercules groups survive. One's with the dragon of the Hesperides here, and with the killing of Busiris. The story of Busiris is not one of the hero's 12 labors, and the inclusion of this story demonstrates the close alliance between the Reformation and humanist studies of ancient texts. In German Protestant culture, ancient languages and texts were taught to a wide segment of the population in the schools that Luther believed should be set up to instruct as many people as possible to read the Bible. And Luther's erudition and admiration for Quintilian's rhetoric, I think, may also explain the straightforward style of these sculptures, carved in sandstone rather than imported marble. They match Quintilian's lowest, plain style that has been compared to the vernacular or Tuscan order in architecture. Sculptures commissioned for the Grosser Garten by Augustus the Strong, when he had become both elector and king of Poland, are more like Quintilian's middle style, which is defined as a pleasing florid style that includes metaphors and figures of speech. Translated into sculptural terms, I think, mainly here by the Venetian Antonio Corradini, but also others like Pietro Balestra, these works employ ornaments, virtuoso effects, and show an absence of strong emotions, since I think those would be saved for Quintilian's third category, the grand, energetic style meant to persuade. Among Corradini's works are groups with two figures, here Bacchus and Ariadne, and here Zephyr and Flora in the Victoria and Albert Museum, ingeniously intertwined with much undercutting, and the sculptor's signature veiled figures. Oops. This is a Vestal Virgin, Tuccia, and this is Time and Truth. There are also centaurs carrying off maidens, obviously inspired by John Bologna, but in marble. And they seem, like John Bologna's figures, balletic and only mildly perturbed by being carried off by these creatures. Here's the other one. So they face each other across a walkway. This is something possibly borrowed from France, because Marly had the whole layout was bilateral symmetry. And finally, at the Victoria and Albert Museum, a Marsyas, who, despite being flayed, refrains from screaming the way a painted Marsyas by Ribera would scream and show pain. These effects appeal to a taste formed by familiarity with the metal and ivory sculptures of the Kunstkammer. A quick comparison with a figure on the Royal Allée of Versailles shows that they correspond more to Quintilian's grand, energetic, persuasive mode. Achilles is seized with lust for warfare when he sees weapons and betrays himself in his disguise, just as Queen Dido is unable to control her emotions, which was, of course, the worst thing in the classical age. So, like religious art in a Catholic church, these sculptures convey lessons. Dresden's Protestant society was expected to learn the lessons through texts, so there the high mode doesn't really appear in the garden sculpture, and does appear, though, in the sculptures of the Catholic court chapel. Per Moser worked with a large team on the Zwinger, designed as the courtyard of a palace, but the palace was never built. Here are other views of it in the 1720s. With an orangerie, fountains, and an extensive and richly varied sculpture program, this space served in 1719 as the setting for wedding festivities for Augustus's son and the daughter of Emperor Joseph I. Theatrical in its concept and use, for a patron who adored masquerades, it expresses the hope that Saxony's Wettin dynasty would one day mount the imperial throne. Although this was not to be, the Zwinger sums up the contradictions of a reign that sought to occupy a middle ground between Protestant and Catholic, Christian and humanist, with a preference for plain or ornamental sculpture. Rejecting the French classical style at Versailles, which Augustus had seen on his travels in 1687, The sculptures of the Swinger became a worthy rejoinder, a unique cultural achievement, magnificent in a new way on its own terms. Thank you.